Hello, everyone. This is Ron Gerber from AngelBeat. I'm so glad you're able to join us for the next 30 or 40 minutes. Matt is one of the top technology strategists there at Datrium, who's a leading firm in the whole field of hyperconverged infrastructure, software-based disaster recovery, integration between on-prem networking and the cloud. They've got a whole wealth of solutions, and their content is always very well received at our live AngelBeat events. As we're all now working from home, one of the big issues that come up is virtual desktops. How do I architect my staff so they can work at home very easily? But a lot of times when you are deploying VDI, you've got to be very attuned to issues around disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is just the different side of the same coin as business continuity. You want to keep operational despite Matt's based in the Carolinas. So he's got to make sure all of his clients work if they are dealing with the threat or actual hurricanes. We all have to have flexibility to be able to work even as we deal with COVID-19 and not be able to go to the office. So the range of issues. And we found it's very important that organizations have the right flexibility to support a work from home computing paradigm. It's critically important, though, that you've got the right disaster recovery that supports a VDI infrastructure. And along those lines, I think that's going to be the main focus of Matt's talk, where individuals absolutely need to have expertise and insights to back up and secure their data, not only in, God forbid, let's say if you get hit by a ransomware attack, but just for general business continuity, compliance, audit requirements, et cetera. So Matt, without any further ado, let me turn it over to you. And again, anyone who is on this webinar, remember you can use the online chat if you've got any questions. We'll try and make this as interactive as possible. And if any questions go unanswered because of time limits or you have to leave, you can always reach out to angelbeat.com. My personal email is rgerber@angelbeat.com, and I'll make sure that the appropriate expert, be it Matt or someone else from Datrium, gets answers to your questions right away. All yours, Matt.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Well, hey, folks, this is Matt Place. I'm a solutions architect with Datrium, and today we're going to go through on-demand disaster recovery for virtual desktop environments. And so you guys have perspective as to what to expect during the presentation. I got a little agenda here. I want to touch on a few topics briefly up front. First of all, why DR is important for VDI. And I think many of you are here simply because you've recognized that perhaps DR may be necessary for your existing desktop infrastructures. But we're going to share some of the things that we've learned, working with actual customers, recently. Then I want to touch on briefly the nature, the complex nature of VDI and the challenges associated with trying to apply a very complex technology stack such as disaster recovery to that use case. And then we're going to look at a few of the traditional, seems like ever-present challenges with traditional DR solutions. And we're doing that because we need to solve for these things given a lot of the circumstances today from ransomware and from the work from home and various other influences. We need to address these DR challenges if we're going to have a viable mechanism that we can rely on for our desktops. And then we're going to go through the actual Datrium DR as a service solution, what it looks like, what its value is, how it functions, and what it can do for you and for your VDI environments. And we'll end with some Q&A if things don't come up during the presentation. So feel free to, again, drop any of those questions into the chat. So let me adjust this thing. Here we go. Now, a few things that I wanted to share around the why DR for VDI. This is based on current real world present interactions that I'm having across my customer base, and I wanted to pick on one in particular who had an interesting situation come up that we've helped them with, and that's I think you're gonna find that it's pretty common circumstances, and this is going to be something that everybody's struggling with these days. But this particular customer had an existing VDI rollout in progress. They were well past the pilot phase, but they were in the initial phase of rollout and ramp for their desktops. They had some persistent, non-persistent, but because of all of the work from home and the COVID, situations that we're dealing with, they had to accelerate those plans tremendously and very much unexpectedly. And so that obviously that necessitated a look at VDI in terms of its status within the organization, because this particular customer has a number of offices, and that's where folks work, or they used to. And now, because they depend on their desktops being virtual to actually get their work done, the VDI has become mission critical for this organization, and that necessitates DR in this particular case. Now, the challenge was, that they face with all of that in trying to solve for that need of having DR for VDI is, the first thing is they just don't have the facilities, the infrastructure to which to DR their desktops. It's just not something they planned for. It's not something that they rationalized within the scope of the original VDI project. And then now, as they look to architect something, they've run into, of course, spending constraints. They don't have the money to go and build out a like-for-like infrastructure at a physical location separate from their production site just to protect their now critical, or rather mission critical, desktop infrastructure services. And then something that I wanted to include, because this is something that I've been discussing with a lot of my customers recently, is while we have to address the short-term pain of the situations that we're all dealing with, we cannot take our eye off the long-term, ball, so to speak, in that there is historically a challenge with rationalizing DR for VDI because of the tremendous cost typically associated with disaster recovery mechanisms, or traditional ones at least. And that's something that we're going to have to rationalize going forward. I think that's an area where Datrium can have a massive impact. So again, please stop me at any time if you have questions, but let's go into the complex nature of VDI. I think I would be preaching to the choir if I were to explain how VDI is complex and the challenges associated with architecting, deploying, and optimizing a desktop infrastructure stack. But I think that the key point here is when you take that and then try to combine that with disaster recovery and achieve that outcome. I mean, just thinking out loud, what do you protect? How do you get the data from point A to point B? In what order should you reconstruct your environment from a disaster, during a disaster? When you think about the run books, what pieces can you orchestrate? What pieces should you do in the orchestration layer from a DR standpoint? What pieces should you do in the desktop infrastructure tool stack? I mean, there's a lot of complexity in trying to meld these two, again, very complex animals together to achieve what should be a very simple outcome of, I have this critical application called VDI. I should be able to instantiate it at my DR site easily, cost effectively, and so on and so forth. Now, the challenge here is that because of this, this technology stack being integrated as it is, with separate products to do the VDI and separate products to do the disaster recovery, it further complicates the problem. And now we're focused in on, hey, how do I integrate this technology with that technology to achieve this outcome, and then how does that interrelate to the next set of integrations that I do? So again, this is the vicious cycle of component-based, micro engineering that we traditionally do in our data centers. Now, as we move forward, I want to point out very briefly, these are some areas that I think that Datrium can have a direct impact on from a desktop infrastructure standpoint in context of DR, things that we are going to make easier and simpler to integrate with a DR mechanism. So just keep those in the back of your mind as we roll forward. Now, and as I said in the agenda, we want to talk about some of the traditional challenges inherent with any disaster recovery, initiative. And I think that what you'll find is that some of the more recent and unlikely causes for disaster recovery actually have a strong correlation with desktops. And what this chart is really meant to represent is the fact that we have, a new kind of top ranking reason for why DR events happen and why we have to engage our DR mechanisms and hope that they work. And that's ransomware. And I know this is on top of everyone's minds. Many of us have probably already dealt with it in some fashion. I hope that you haven't, and I hope that you never have to. But frankly, it's more of a matter of when, not if, you'll have to address the some type of ransomware infection. Now, believe it or not, this is exactly the key reason why these DR events are happening. And think about the nature of ransomware. This is the correlation I'd like to highlight. It's my personal belief that the likelihood of a ransomware infection increases the closer or the more closely involved that we have an actual human in a particular process, system, or what have you. So what that means for desktops is that, unlike back office infrastructure from an IT standpoint, where you may have an operator directly interfacing with something, and if the stars align and you do some really silly things, then you can open yourself up to a ransomware attack from an operational perspective in that back office infrastructure. It's much more likely, in my opinion, that a virtual desktop is going to be the target of a ransomware infection, because of the nature of our end users and users being users, and the fact that they have access to email and internet and can click on things, and in many cases, maybe they lack the training or the knowledge to understand when they should click on something and when they shouldn't. So the point is that ransomware is a key driver for disaster recovery events in general, and I think it's going to be even a greater driver for the reason for DR in desktop infrastructures. And the challenge with that is, ransomware is causing the fact that backups are no longer sufficient, a sufficient recovery mechanism, in and of themselves, because again, VDI, as an example, is highly complex. We can't just simply recover data. We have to think about the implications of recovering the infrastructure, the order of operations, and things like that. And of course, we all need instant gratification these days. So if we're going to recover something, we have to have it as quick as possible. We can't take, days and weeks and months to recover a functional infrastructure. Now, again, one more thing to expand on in terms of the legacy or traditional challenges with disaster recovery is the fact that as we look to, the current needs of disaster recovery, we really need that quick RTO. We need to be able to deal with the inevitable infection of ransomware, and it's got to be easy to use. But the challenge is, historically, DR mechanisms are highly complex and also highly expensive. You got a lot of different products, all performing little niche, roles within the broader scope of DR. And there's a lot of integration that has to happen, a lot of things that have to be kept up with, and that's where it becomes unreliable. Are your integrations kept up to date? When you update your VDI infrastructure, just as a matter of course of maintaining your data center, how does that have an impact downstream on the mechanisms that make DR viable for your organization? Furthermore, if you have workloads that you've added to your environment, have we actually kept up with things and protected those from both a backup and a DR perspective? And the inverse, if we've vacated some workloads from the organization, have we updated our policies to focus in on those things? And then when's the last time you've tested it? So nevertheless, DR in general has up until this point remained a very expensive, complex, and generally unreliable technology, despite the time and effort and money put into it to build it up in the first place. So these are the key areas that we're going to address from a Datrium perspective, and that's kind of the impetus for us developing our technologies. Now, one more thing from a kind of a landscape perspective as we move into the actual solution itself, I wanted to throw this up here just to kind of illustrate what our viewpoint is in terms of where does Datrium fit into the ecosystem and the evolution of backup and DR over a long time, and how that relates to the speed of recovery and how easy it is to operate the environment. And then it also emphasizes the deeply coupled nature between backup and DR if your goal is to have speedy recovery, but also to have inherent protection from ransomware through the traditional granularity of backups. And the fact of the matter is, when you start looking at this through the lens of the cloud, what can we use the cloud for to enhance disaster recovery and backup? This is when we start to address the cost economics of disaster recovery and the challenges associated with that, and combining that with speed of recovery and ease of use. And this is where we actually start to see a convergence of all of these elements and actually see some valuable outcomes. And it really is all about backup and DR combined with the cloud in a thoughtful manner. We can't get away, we cannot achieve these results with a backup only cloud focused strategy. So talking about the solution and talking about the need to converge these core data center functions around disaster recovery and backup, and through that drive operational simplicity and to solve for some of these challenges around the time it takes to back up and or DR something and the cost associated with it. This is the DNA of Datrium. Datrium is inherently a converged company, both from the way that we operate, but also the product that we produced. We are a singular software-defined SaaS-based platform that provides all of these functions. And we do that because the only way to achieve speedy recovery with inherent ransomware protection and do this for VDI is to be able to maintain control over all aspects of everything that happens from where the workload is running through the backup and out to the actual execution of an orchestrated DR. You have to handle all of those pieces together and coordinate them to have the right outcome. Now, thinking about the DNA of our company, the founders of Datrium bring to us the kind of the foundational expertise around core desktop infrastructure, core virtual machine infrastructure. We bring to the table the expertise around backups, data reduction, which is critical to controlling the costs of our infrastructure, and the ability to get data to where it needs to be in sync and all that kind of stuff from a backup and a replication standpoint. These founders are all experts in those areas, and it was a kind of a amalgamation of those capabilities into a singular solution that really makes Datrium different from everything else out in the industry. So I know I've been speaking quickly and a lot up until this point. I'm going to pop over to the chat to make sure that there aren't any questions, and then we'll keep going. Ron, do you see any questions in the chat?
No, I think we're good to go. I'll just add a comment. You know, one of the things that unfortunately comes up a lot, and it relates to ransomware, is during any either hurricane or in this case, COVID-19 disasters, there's all these unfortunate cyber criminals who come out of the woodworks, or, you know, and you hear all these stories about people, and I hear them, no one wants to admit to this, where there's a button or someone gets an email saying, oh, here's where I can finally get some hand sanitizers. Remember, there's a huge concern over availability of hand sanitizer just a few months ago, or N95 mask. And people clicked on them, and we heard from quite a few people who, by the way, missed AngelBeat events, so they didn't get a chance to hear from experts in Datrium. And so when they click on these links because they think it's a savior, in turn, what happens, it triggers a ransomware attack. And they're, you know, if it was bad enough getting hit with ransomware before COVID-19, it's much worse trying to recover. So I see a lot of the computing paradigm changing where VDI, work from home, are so critically important, but at the same time, you want to make sure you do it right, which is why I know firsthand why these kind of solutions that Matt is talking about are so important.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate that. That was good color there. So now, from a Datrium perspective, you know, what is the actual solution that we're talking about? What is DR as a service? And frankly, I think we should also take some time throughout the rest of this this talk to define what DR as a service, or rather to address what DR as a service should be defined as, because that's a very common overused term these days, just as cloud has been for the last 10 years. And not every cloud is created equally, and therefore not every DR as a service capability is created equally. And I think that that's something that I would encourage you folks to pay close attention to as we go through this, because there are some very distinct advantages to the approach that Datrium has taken to solutioning a product set that will achieve these type of DR outcomes, that puts it in a whole new category of its own versus any other DR as a service, potential capability out there in the market today. So what you see before you is really just a very high level kind of illustration of what DR as a service is for Datrium and some of the value that it brings to the table. And then we're going to kind of go deeper into, what the flow of a DR might look like. And that's kind of, what to expect next. But what we're really describing here is a single software-defined based platform that bridges both on-prem and the multi-prem and cloud instances with a single data plane, providing a consistent presentation of services from how we handle data, compression, dedupe, encryption, and so forth, with a implicit or integrated backup mechanism, which on top of we layer an orchestrated DR capability that enables us to take data from a Datrium platform on-prem, or frankly, any other VMware-based infrastructure, regardless of the fundamental backend, storage and compute platform behind that. Take that data, replicate that out to the public cloud for both backup and DR purposes, and then using that backup data, live mount that into the VMware cloud on AWS on demand, and with an instant RTO, start your workload and get you back up and running. And we're going to step through some of the benefits of this in a little bit more detail, but I think I've touched on a few of those: on demand, spinning these things up in an orchestrated fashion. These are the hallmarks of what DR should be, and frankly, what DR as a service should be delivered as. And we have to make sure that we're not solving for point needs or individual challenges within the organization. We're not here to address ransomware solely. We're not here to address just backup and give you a way to get data into the cloud. We have to be comprehensive with these, because these topics are all interrelated, and going down one particular path on one of these topics may preclude you from addressing some of the operational complexity of the other areas that you need to address. So let me click on this so we can keep going. Now, the interesting thing about Datrium's solution, do we have a question here? Let's check. Whoops. It's just Rob providing some commentary. So what Datrium talks about here is the idea of combining the best of what cloud brings to bear, which is the fact that you can get resources on demand. They tend to scale as you need them. Therefore, you don't have to pay for them until you use them. Those are, provide some distinct economic advantages, regardless of the topic that we're talking about. And if you combine those things that make cloud beneficial and unique with thoughtful placement of software-defined technologies on-prem, what we're able to achieve is a solution that enables us to deliver DR as a service in an on-demand capacity that allows you to scale it only as you need to use it and as demand grows during the event of a DR situation. And that's wholly different from a traditional DR approach, where you frankly have to go build out another full data center with a full stack of infrastructure commensurate with the workload that you're trying to protect. That becomes a sunk cost, and that has to have, that has to be maintained over time. So there's an operational overhead to that. And so there's a tremendous amount of cost and complexity associated with a traditional approach to DR. What we're talking about is a software-defined approach, wherein we have a multitude of deployment models. So through DRES Connect, we can download a VM. We can then, build out it's an OVA. We download the OVA, we instantiate that in your existing VMware environment, and then you log into our cloud portal to create your backup policies and your DR policies. That then that will then cause the backup and the replication of that associated data out to our DR as a service cloud instances, specifically Cloud DVX. That data will get stored in a compressed, dedupe, encrypted capacity on S3. And then if you were to instantiate or need to actually fail over, you simply click on the failover button of your DR policy, which will then, will spin up an on-demand cloud SDDC instance on the, the VMware cloud on AWS, and fail over your workload into that cloud. And all of those pieces of the process are fully orchestrated. And we can do that coming from either your existing SAN infrastructure, your existing NAS-based three-tiered, platforms, traditional HCI or legacy HCI, vendors, you know all the names out there, or even Datrium disaggregated HCI style infrastructures. We can take that data, get it out to the cloud, and in roughly 10 minutes, get you a fully functional DR capability. Now, what's another thing that we can do that's really interesting is we can also protect workloads running in the cloud. So whether you have to fail over to the VMware cloud on AWS in a DR situation, or you want to actually run some workloads out there steady state, maybe you're protecting some key portions of your desktop infrastructure, such as your global load balancing and local load balancing and things like that. One of the things that you may want to do with workloads sitting out in the cloud is have another backup and DR mechanism for those. Because, hey, we might already be in a failure situation, but that doesn't mean we have to remain in a degraded state. We can run a workload out there in the cloud in a DR situation and have it continually protected to an on-demand VMware cloud instance, adjacent to it, again, without incurring any cost of actually instantiating and running that SDDC environment, that second SDDC environment. So let me look and see if there's anything in the chat, because I see some things popping up. Just reading, I apologize, I'm just reading some of the comments here. Yeah, so that's a good question, David, around the S3 Max. So the interesting thing is we're not like a traditional cloud-based backup mechanism, which is essentially dumping your data into S3 in a native kind of fashion. We, probably for lack of a better term, proxy our software in front of S3 and intercept and coordinate and handle and manage all of the interactions of the transfer of data, the storing of data, and the implementation of data services. And the net outcome is, architecturally speaking, we work around those types of limits that are or constraints in terms of S3. And what you're interacting with and what our software is, is interacting with, the failover mechanism and so forth, is a file system running on top of S3. Using S3 is simply just an object, backend object store. So what we're traditionally doing is we're breaking down our data sets into 8 meg groupings of data, and we're sequencing those out as writes into the infrastructure, whether the backend be S3 or it be our disaggregated HCI stuff on-prem, in your data center. So I'm sure that we can get you some even greater clarity on that question, but hopefully that gives you a flavor for what how we're handling it. Excellent. So moving on, let's get to the next slide here, because this is really the high-level architecture. We're going to suck the data in from your existing VMware infrastructures and be able to DR that on demand into the cloud, and then also through DRES Connect be able to protect those steady-state workloads that are living in the cloud, either temporarily in a DR situation or permanently, and protect that, again, on demand with another SDDC instance. Now, the beauty of on demand is that is helping us control the cost associated with DR. So now let's step through what this looks like. Now let's say that in any one of those deployment scenarios, we take an outage. The first thing that's going to happen is we're going to go into the data center, we're going to go into the cloud portal, the Cloud DVX management portal, and we're going to select our failover policy and go ahead and execute that failover policy. And essentially with one click, we'll be able to instantly mount and start up the virtual machines that are part of that policy and start those running on a VMware Cloud SDDC instance. And while we're running out there in steady state, we're keeping a track of all of the changes that are happening during that, activation of those VMs, the live mount of those VMs, and the running of those VMs, again, in steady state in that SDDC instance. Now, for those of you that may not be familiar with VMware's cloud on AWS, to oversimplify it, it's a vSphere cluster in the cloud, effectively. And what's great about it is its consistency in operations. You have vSphere and vCenter on-prem. You're going to have vCenter in the cloud, and you'll be able to manage things in the same fashion. So once we've actually executed a DR failover, VMs are going to get registered and come up, and essentially you'll be in vCenter again, doing everything as you would typically do on-prem. It just happens to be in the cloud. Now, as we're running in steady state out there, we're tracking all these changes so that when we do the one-click failback after the DR is resolved, we then are able to shut down the SDDC instance and stop the meter, so you're no longer incurring costs associated with that DR infrastructure. So there's a couple of key things I want to highlight here that we just solved from a traditional DR challenges perspective. The first is the cost associated with DR is tremendously high, typically because we have to build out a full infrastructure in a full data center somewhere and run that all the time and all of the stuff that goes along with that. In this type of a model, we can get this down to an on-demand execution of that DR infrastructure, so that we only spin up that infrastructure if and when there is a disaster, or perhaps when there's a actual proactive DR test. And it's only in those circumstances that we would incur the cost of running that VMware Cloud instance until we get through those activities. We'll run it, and then we shut it down and we stop the meter. So that has a tremendous impact on reducing the overall cost of the DR infrastructure portion of traditional disaster recovery. Now, the second part question, if data on-prem is flash and data in the cloud is S3, is there a performance impact on DR? Good question. So one of the things that, for the sake of time, that we weren't drilling into right now is there's some mechanics behind the scenes, and actually we'll talk about that right now, and that actually segues into the next point I was going to make around the differentiation, and that has to do with change-only failback. So what we do is it's a thoughtful use of flash, spinning disk, S3 object storage, and this is across cloud and on-prem. It's a thoughtful application of each of those technologies where they make the most sense, so we can balance the need for performance, without degrading anything from an application perspective, but also not break the bank by unnecessarily applying flash in every place that that we could possibly stick it. So specifically to answer your question, when we do this failover into the cloud, we do a live mount. So this, we're fast forwarding ahead. There's another slide that visualizes this a little bit more differently, or maybe a little bit better, is the fact that this S3 backed data store that we're maintaining out there is not just a backup endpoint. It is also a live mountable NFS data store, and we're one of only 3 vendors on the planet today that VMware authorizes to do third-party storage into the VMware cloud. So what happens during a failover event is when you click that failover button, we immediately mount that Datrium data store as NFS to the VMware Cloud SDDC. We activate the VM since it's just an NFS data store. VMware has no other has no idea that there's all this other stuff going on behind the scenes, and we start running the VMs. And in that mode, you can expect approximately 500 megabytes per second of throughput. I think less than 10 milliseconds of average latency, and about 50,000 IOPS on average is what the S3 ecosystem is capable of in this use case. So for that initial period, that's what the performance profile is going to look like. But at the same time, we're going to start executing vMotions into the actual NVMe-based vSAN environment inside of the VMware cloud. So your workloads will actually end up physically in the actual SDDC infrastructure once those storage vMotions have completed. And that's where they will run steady state until such time as you fail back. And that's where it gets really interesting. So I know that was a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but I wanted to tee that up a little bit because it leads into the change-only failback. So yeah, keep the questions rolling. Now, when we start talking about failback, that's, when I talk about it getting interesting is if you look at the landscape of all their DR and backup mechanisms available today, failback is a big challenge because traditionally, when you talk about any other vendor on the planet, you're talking about if you ship 100 terabytes into the cloud, in a backup capacity or a DR capacity, you want to come back on-prem with that, you're going to bring at least that 100 terabytes back, plus whatever changes that may have occurred, from the moment of failover, and forward. Well, what makes Datrium different is when we do this activation of the VMs, we can track all of the changes that happen to that VM over the course of its operation in the cloud. So that's inclusive of the startup in our live mount situation. That's inclusive of the storage vMotion into the vSAN-based environment inside of the SDDC. And when we do this failback, we essentially capture only the changes that have occurred from the moment it went into the SDDC to when we initiate the failback. So we know the before picture. We know what the current state is of the VM when it's about to be failed back, and we do a differential analysis of that and determine what blocks need to come back on-prem. So we pull just that data out of the cloud, pull that back into basically the S3 backed data store in the cloud, and then using our software to proxy that coordination of getting that just those changes back on-prem to your primary infrastructure. So what that really does is that has a direct impact on not only the time it takes to fail back from the cloud, drastically reducing the amount of time because you're not having to take data that's been rehydrated and kind of copy that back to another location and then bring that back on-prem, and then the egress or costs associated with that is the other area that we have a significant impact on. Is you're not bringing 100 plus terabytes back in the example that I mentioned earlier. You're bringing back only the changes that have occurred from the moment that you started that workload in the cloud to when you shut it off and tried to fail back. And again, because we have this broad awareness through the fact that we have all this insight through the software-defined platform being present in each of these locations. Are the changes accounted for continuously like a differential backup or at the time of need? In the case of failback, and I should probably get clarity and defer to some of our engineering folks on this, but in context of failback, it's more at the time of need. So we capture the state of the VM as it enters the VMware cloud, as we vMotion it into that data store, and then through change block tracking inside of the data store inside of VMware, we're able to keep a record of, again, all those changes, and then we compare the before state and the current state as we execute the failback. Let's see here. Yeah, so that's what I just described there. Hopefully that answers your question. It is not necessarily a continuous, it's not like a CDP backup. It's just a before state and a current state comparison, and then we suck out just the differential bits that we don't have already as we try to fail back. However, we do something completely different from that when you're talking about steady state backups of an actual virtual machine. That's entirely different. So hopefully that clarifies some stuff for you, Antonio. Perfect. Good questions. So we're gonna keep going for the sake of time. So what we've effectively done is we failed back, change only failed back, lower cost because of lower egress costs, and faster failback due to the fact that we're shipping a much smaller footprint of data back on-prem. Now this is that diagram that I mentioned earlier that kind of visualizes, if you will, what our cloud backup data store looks like. So we have the same exact software that we run on-prem for our disaggregated infrastructure solution, or hyperconverged solution, is what we run in the cloud. And the S3 data store is that persistent data storage layer for us, and we leverage it, again, as a direct object store. Now, from a backup standpoint, one thing to know about our platform, and obviously this talk was focused in on DR for VDI, not so much on what we do on-prem for primary infrastructure, but one of the hallmarks of our platform is we are the only vendor out there that gives you the ability to really kind of have your cake and eat it too from a storage services standpoint. We're the only platform out there that provides always on data reduction through compression and deduplication with always on encryption that's in use, in flight, and at rest for all data, primary and secondary. So that's backup and replicated DR data and things like that. And we do that for everything. And there's no tuning, there's no activating it. It's just always on, it's planned for, it's baked into the architecture. And we do all of that not only without degrading performance of the applications or overtaxing or overburdening our physical infrastructures, but we're able to do that in many cases while increasing performance. And then on top of that, all of the data is protected as you would expect, but from a high availability standpoint, but particularly on-prem with our DHCI solution, everything is erasure coded to a RAID 6 equivalent. And that's just simply all data. So if you look at the Datrium philosophy, is we felt that it was inappropriate and unnecessary in this day and age with the technology that we have to force our customers and prospects to choose between performance, availability, certain storage capabilities, storage security, and the operational simplicity of your environment. Usually you have to pick one or two or three of those. You can't have all of those things. And that extends out to the cloud to an extent as well. When we're looking at this S3 data store, everything is deduped, everything is compressed, and everything is inherently encrypted. So there is absolutely no rehydration or VM conversion going on with our backup, our restore, or our disaster recovery failover and failback in and out of the cloud. Now, this backup data store is a lot more, as I mentioned earlier, it's also a live data store. And this is what really sets us apart from any other cloud-based vendor out there that's trying to provide backup and DR. Backup and DR are tightly coupled, and trying to disassociate those two from an architectural standpoint is very challenging and frankly inefficient and a fool's errand, I think, personally. And the way that we approached it is DR builds on backup, backup builds on how we handle, process, and store data. And that's kind of what's really expressed here. And because we have this live data store, we are able to tap into that with our DR orchestration to automatically mount those VMs and go ahead and instantly restore those. Now, to harken back to disaster recovery for a second and VDI and ransomware, where this becomes super important is think about, we talked about the need to perform a disaster recovery on our VDI workloads. And there's a lot of different reasons that we might choose to do that or need to do that. But if we look specifically at ransomware for a moment, that what this approach, this thoughtful approach to an architecture allows us to achieve is a much broader coverage of actually addressing the need of ransomware. And that is the fact that when you have to recover for a ransomware event, you're likely not recovering to the most recent backup that you've done. And in just about every other DR solution out there, at least that I'm aware of, they may have orchestrated DR capabilities. They may do some things similar to what we do, but what you're left with is a capability that can only recover you to the most recent backup that you've done and shipped out to the cloud. Whereas because of the nature of everything being data reduced and us being able to store a broad granularity, or that's oxymoronic, I guess, but a broad number of potential restore points, giving you great granularity in choosing where and when I might want to recover to, that is necessary for ransomware recovery. And when you combine that with our DR orchestrator being able to tap into any recovery point, whether it be 1 minute old, 5 minutes old, 5 hours old, 5 months, or even 5 years old, we can orchestrate the recovery to any one of those points in time from the same backup data store that we've now maintained in the cloud. So it's a one-stop shop. You don't have to do special things to get special outcomes like we're describing, like you may have to with other solutions. We just inherently, just due to the nature of how we handle data, enable all of these capabilities in a single platform. And that's really what we're talking about here in addressing ransomware. And that's what's so crucial for VDI, is if that's going to be the place that we're most likely to get infected by ransomware, we need to be able to have instant recoverability. That means that we have to have no rehydration, and that comes from our file system and from the data platform that we've created. You really can't do that unless you have this comprehensive approach, starting with primary and working all the way to backup and through to disaster recovery. And we have to do this without creating unnecessary additional copies of the data. And then we also have to be able to recover to any point in time, whether, again, it be minutes or years old. And also these backups have to be immutable. And, you know, that's the thing, is if your backups are mutable, then you're open to the possibility that this great mechanism you put in place to protect yourself from ransomware can in and of itself get infected by ransomware and be you know, ineligible for you to use as a mechanism to recover and reoperationalize your workers and getting their desktops up and things like that. And then lastly is you can't just bring up one or two desktops. You have to bring up the vast majority of the infrastructure. And particularly if you're talking about persistent desktops, having an orchestration capability that allows us to achieve, say, this ransomware recovery outcome in an orchestrated fashion allows us to scale operationally to be able to afford to bring up, you know, thousands of VMs quickly enough to satisfy the demand. From a non-persistent standpoint, what I'm traditionally doing with some of my customers is even getting more creative by leveraging the cloud, you know, scaling capabilities and so forth. Is why don't we just protect the golden images and some of the base core VDI infrastructure? And that's really all you're paying for to store in the cloud and protect from a Datrium software standpoint. And when we instantiate that as a failover, during a failover, and that workload comes online, then you use the native VDI tools to scale your non-persistent desktops out back to, you know, however many thousands of desktops you may need in that situation. So I think we're getting closer to the end, but a couple more points we really need to highlight here that really set our solution apart from everything else out in the industry is, if you harken back to the some of the historical challenges to DR that I mentioned earlier, we talked about cost, we talked about complexity, and hopefully you're seeing how we're addressing both of those. Again, none of this software stuff that I've talked about that Datrium provides really requires any tuning, any massive customization or anything like that to actually achieve these results. I mean, there's no integration. It's just simply programming it with the details unique to your organization and your workloads for your run books, setting up some network reachability elements as it pertains to the cloud. And you know, those are unique to your organizations. Those aren't the boilerplate underlying infrastructures for VDI or for DR. Those things should be automated, and frankly, that's what we've achieved here. Now, it's all well and good to get something stood up that's even simple to operate, like our capability is, but unless you can guarantee that this capability that you've paid money and spent time building out and putting in place is viable when you need it to be, then what good is it? And that's the other historical challenge with DRs, because they're so inherently complex, they're hard to maintain, or difficult to maintain, and as a result, things end up not working when you actually need them to. In fact, I have a customer right now that had to write down north of $300 million due to a ransomware attack. And because of that, in that situation, they decided to engage their DR capability. And I won't name the technologies, but it didn't work. And it was because of these fundamental reasons of, despite our best efforts, the complexity of the tasks of maintaining the infrastructure, as well as doing the moves, adds, and changes of actual workloads, meant that their DR capability was out of date. So all that being said, the point is Datrium has solved that problem through our continuous compliance checking mechanism that's integrated into this technology. So what we do is we validate all of the constituent elements of this solution that we have control over, visibility into, and we validate those for compliance to ensure that they're functional, they're available, they're configured properly, and therefore, if and when you have to hit the big blue button, in our case, you can be assured that that mechanism will work. So we validate the policies, we validate the availability of the infrastructure, we validate the resources are there, we validate the data is intact and you know, and is recoverable. And what's cool is we do this every 30 minutes automatically. So 48 times a day, you're getting notifications potentially that your DR mechanisms are in place and ready to go if you want to execute against them. And then beyond that, we also have a very detailed reporting mechanism on that. That if for example, somebody was to go in and rename a data store or delete a data store or remove a critical VM, that was a part of the plan, within 30 minutes, we'll have picked up on that in the compliance engine, and you have some type of awareness of that. And that's the challenge of why it's so difficult to maintain these things with our traditional mechanisms today outside of Datrium, is because half the time we don't even know that something's changed to go and address it and fix it. So that's really what the compliance engine does, and we extend it one step further in that we enable tests to be done. So whether that be prem-to-prem failover or prem-to-cloud failover from a DR standpoint, we can do these test failovers, validating everything else to another degree, and then orchestrating the cleanup of those tests. And there's a tremendous amount of extensive audit level detail in the reporting mechanisms that can be exported following those tests and become handed to your typical compliance controllers and satisfy their desire to make sure that the infrastructure is ready to go. And I think the last thing I'll say here is that in terms of operational simplification is that, if you're going to start leveraging the cloud, traditionally it's very challenging because you've got all of these various pieces of the puzzle that you have to stitch together and be responsible for. You have to build expertise around, and then all of that even leads to the billing aspect of this, that you've got to know Amazon, you got to know VMC, you've got to know this and that. In reality, we want to solve all of that as well. And this should be the scope of, what you consider, you have to consider to execute a DR capability with Datrium. You pick your SLA, you create your plans. That's what you should focus on, what really matters. Let us handle all of the rest. Let us handle the complexity inherent in AWS. Let us handle the complexity in building out a VMware-based environment and orchestrating that and managing your backups, managing your data, and so on and so forth. So, in summary, we provide cloud-based backup capabilities, tightly integrated with orchestrated disaster recovery. We do so on demand to the VMware cloud. We do this in addition to or in place of on-prem to on-prem failover. We provide instant recovery to any point in time, which is how we aid in the ability to use DR orchestration as a mechanism to recover from ransomware. And it's super, super easy to use. Most of it is built out for you or orchestrated or automated in some fashion. And that's really how we solve DR for VDI and make this viable in light of the current circumstances from work from home and the ever-present threat of ransomware. So I'm going to go ahead and back to the chat and see if there's any other questions. Is there any AI integration which will help identify when a breach occurred? Great question. Yes. So today, we do not have an integrated mechanism that can help or aid into the detecting the possibility of a ransomware infection. It is absolutely something that we're currently exploring. Our focus has been on leveraging what we're really good at around handling and managing data to give you an instant ability to recover to any point in time from an immutable backup, and do so even from a DR orchestration perspective, if that makes more sense in the circumstances. But and then using that compliance check engine that I talked about, I think you can imagine a potential future by investing in a platform like Datrium. We'll eventually get to a point where we have the visibility into the data inherently. It just stands to reason that we can put that to use and maybe use that as a potential early warning detection system for ransomware infections. Okay, is there any, let's see here, is there any integration or plans of integration into customer platforms such as ServiceNow? Absolutely, that is something that we're exploring currently. We do not have any explicit integrations with ServiceNow from a cloud services perspective, be it the DR orchestration or cloud backup. I believe there are some things that we do with ServiceNow integrated into our on-premise DHCI infrastructure solution. And that's something that we can definitely go into in the future in more detail if you're interested.
Hey, Matt, this is Ron Gerber. I think this is a lot of great comments. And for the people on the webinar, really appreciate your questions. For those individuals who may be looking at this webinar in the future on an on-demand basis, remember, you can always go to angelbeat.com or datrium.com. You can contact either company. My personal email is rgerber@angelbeat.com. So you have questions on How do you go about integrating with other platforms beyond ServiceNow? Or if you've got some existing security tools, how do they fit in directly today with Datrium? Let us know. And Matt and his colleagues can make sure that based on your current infrastructure, he can lay out how you go about deploying Datrium in those environments and any other solution that you're currently working with. So I just want to emphasize that. Is that a fair statement, Matt?
Yes, sir. Yeah, we're here to help. You can see some of the links on the screen. These are some good details that you can get to on your own, but certainly we'd be happy to not only engage you directly, but also to perhaps get you to the right people geographically speaking. And I think there's a lot of really interesting detail that we can get into. And I just would love the opportunity to get down to helping you folks solve your need for DR for VDI as best I can.
One final point I'd like to make, and I've seen this through literally hundreds, if not thousands of Angel Beat events, is IT professionals and senior management, they all agree in the importance of DR. They all agree that they need to do run-throughs and making sure that their DR plans work. And in theory, they're all on board with that. In practicality, when you schedule a whole big weekend shutdown, something gets in the way and people don't actually test all their DR programs or they have other initiatives. And we see that a lot. And a lot of times people get burned and then it's a real big problem. So I find it interesting myself to hear what Matt's saying, because organizations of all sizes, you shouldn't worry about the hassles about doing DR testing it. Just rely upon Datrium because they've done all the hard work. And you just have to focus more on architectural, strategic decisions on what you want to back up and when. And you can pretty much be guaranteed that Datrium will take care of that without your having to shut down everything over a weekend, because it just works. It's just really as simple as that. And I think that's a big trend going on for many individuals. We saw it, even in the past years when Datrium, and I think Matt alluded to this, when people talked about hyper-converged infrastructures, when you're trying to link together virtualization, storage, compute, networking in one on-prem appliance. Another huge innovation, because it freed people from doing the tedious work of racking and stacking switches and whatnot, and freed IT professionals to look at more strategic issues, which makes them a more valuable employee, which makes their organizations more nimble. By doing these kind of initiatives, they can accelerate their employer's path towards digital transformation and cost savings. So, I think this is a very relevant topic, and not just in the COVID-19 world, but for many months and years to come, because IT professionals need to look at their role more strategically, which is how they can make more money and make their employers more successful, and less focused on the tedious tasks that are often associated with responsibilities like DR. And Matt, I don't know if you want to add anything. That's just my final thought before we end the webinar.
Yeah, Ron, I honestly couldn't have said it any better. I mean, that's you. If you guys remember back to that slide where I talked about combining the complexity of VDI on top of the complexity of traditional DR, it's too much. And despite our best efforts, and I've been a technologist for a long time, and been hands-on, been on the vendor side, been on the partner side. The bottom line is, we could probably make it work and make it work right, and we could probably do that once. We do that the first time. But as soon as time goes by, things change, and the infrastructure and the DR mechanism and the workload changes enough that now this great mechanism that we spent all this time and money putting together is no longer viable. And what that says to me is we have to get away from what I call microengineering everything, and you got to get into this more of a macro engineering perspective, where let the minutia be handled by the vendors, by the partners, by the whomevers, because a lot of that stuff, that's boilerplate, it's commonplace, and it's going to be a part of any solution, that is in this type of a space for, in the case of VDI and DR, for example. Where you should be spending your time is engineering your disaster recovery run books, your protection groups, orchestrating your desktop infrastructure and managing that, and kind of thinking about how to apply these technologies and actual solving real problems. You shouldn't have to be spending your time any longer stitching individual point solutions and individual capabilities together to potentially build a cohesive whole that does what you actually want it to do. That's my personal philosophy, and that's why I'm at Datrium.
That's great. All right. Well, remember, you can look at datrium.com, angelbeat.com. I hope everyone is safe. I hope that the medical scientists come up with treatments and vaccines so AngelBeat can go on the road again and interact with people. Probably aren't going to shake your hands for a little while, but at least we can do an elbow or fist pump when I greet you at the registration tables. But you can always count on AngelBeat for having experts like Matt cover very highly relevant topics. I wish everyone well, and I'm going to end the webinar now, and thank you all very much, and be well.
Thanks, Ron. Really appreciate it, sir.